All right, first we need to install Jest. So npm install Jest with save dev flag. All right, now back in the code, let's go to package.json. First, we need to change our npm test script. So we change this to Jest with watch all flag. Now I'm typing fast because I'm assuming you have done this exercise, so there is no point you sit there, watch me typing one character at a time. So back in the project, let's add a new folder for our tests. And it's a good practice to separate unit and integration tests, because sometimes you may want to run only the unit tests because they're faster. So let's create a folder, unit. Now in this folder, we mimic the structure of our project because we're taking a piece of this application and testing it in isolation. So that piece that we're taking is inside the models folder. So we add models folder here. And in this folder, we'll have user.test.js. Okay. Now let's add our describe block. And by the way, what we create here using the describe function is a test suite. So a test suite is a container for multiple tests or specs. So here our test suite is user.generate auth token. Here's the body of this test suite. Now this method should return a valid JSON Web Token. So first we need to create a user object. So we need to import it on the top. So require. Now we need to go a few levels up like this, 3 levels. Now we get to the models folder and then we can load the user module. Then we store it here. And if you remember, we need to use object destructure syntax because this module exports an object with 2 properties. One is this user, the other is our validate function. So with this, let's create a user object, new user. We initialize it, set the ID, and is admin. Now we call user the generate auth token. We get the token. Now we need to validate this token. So first we need to load our JSON Web Token library. So require JSON Web Token and store it in this constant. Then we call JWT.verify. We give the token. Now we need the private key. So first we need to load the config module. So require config. And then we call config.get. The name of the application setting is JWT private key. So if we have a valid token, it will be decoded and returned here. Otherwise, this will throw an exception and this will make our test fail. So finally, we need to expect that this decoded object matches this object that we pass here. So in the payload, we should have 2 properties, underline ID, which should be 1, and is admin, which should be true. Now, if you run this test is going to fail. You will see why in a second. All right, back in the terminal, let's run npm test. All right, look at this error. Node env value of test did not match any deployment config file names. So basically the reason we get this error is because when we run our tests using Jest, Jest configures node env or node environment to test. Now here in our configuration folder, we don't have a configuration file for our testing environment. So we need to add a new file here, test.json, and then copy everything we have in default.json into this file. Now here we should also set JWT private key. And with this, we don't have to set an environment variable on a machine where we want to run our tests. We can simply read the private key from this file. Now back in the terminal, let's run npm test. All right, our test failed. So we expected that object to have these 2 properties, ID and is admin. But what we get is an object like this. It has IAT, which is the timestamp for when the token was created. We also have isAdmin. So what happened to the underline ID property? Well, because underline ID is of type object ID, we cannot set it to a simple number like 1. So when creating this user object, we need to set this property to a valid object ID. For that, we need to load Mongoose. So require Mongoose. And then we can set ID to a new mongoose.types.object_ID. Now here's the problem. Every time we create a new ID, that ID is going to be different. So when making an assertion, we need to know the ID that we put in this user object ahead of time. So what I'm going to do is extract this object, store it here as payload, and then initialize our user object with this payload. And then finally, we can ensure that that decoded JSON Web Token matches this payload. Okay, now back in the terminal, let's scroll down. All right, our test failed. Let's see what's happening. So what we have here, this object in green, is what we expected. So we expect this ID property to be an object ID, and this is how that object ID is internally represented using an array of numbers. But what we received is a string representation of this object ID. Because when we call generate authentication token, this JWT library will convert this object ID to a hexadecimal string to store it in the payload of the token. So our test failed because in our JSON Web Token, we have ID as a string, but in our payload object here, we have ID as a real object ID. So here we need to call toHex string, and then let's reformat this so our test is readable. Okay, save the changes, back in the terminal, you can see our test is passing.